Hey everyone, great to be back here at Spring I/O. It's actually the fourth consecutive time I'm speaking here, but indeed I was also there at the very first edition in Madrid when I was still working for SpringSource. Today I'm going to be talking to you about using the JSON library for efficient JSON processing in Spring Boot applications, as you can see here. What you see here on the slide, actually, you may recognize some of the logos, but maybe not the two in the middle. So that little cowboy there, that is actually the little icon that the author of the library uses for himself, because his handle is Cowtown Coder. His actual name is Tatu something. I'm really bad with names, so it's Tatu Saloranta, actually. And he publishes JSON as a library under the group ID of faster XML, right? Which may be a bit confusing because we're not actually going to talk about XML today. We're going to be talking about JSON. Now, the title of this is Action JSON, and the inspiration of that actually came from an '88 movie, as you can see here. It's a pretty terrible action movie, actually, but I thought the tagline, "It's time for action," really brings out what we need. So I chose that actually as the title for today. And like with every popular project, of course, this thing has been forked. So actually, in 2014, they made a movie in India, also called Action JSON. I don't think it's even based on the exact same scenario. I did look up the reviews for you, though, which were very interesting. One of the reviewers said, well, the font that they used for the credits at least was legible. Right? So I thought that was quite hilarious. Actually, we all know how important readable code is, so maybe it's a good thing. Anyways, why am I doing this talk? It turns out that in today's landscape, when you are building enterprise applications, you have to work with JSON. Doesn't matter what your opinions about JSON are. JSON doesn't care if you like it or not. It's sort of inevitable, right? And when we're working with JSON in Spring Boot, typically that means that we will be using JSON, because that is the default JSON library that you get when you simply use the Spring Boot starters. And what I've seen in practice is that a lot of people do this, maybe even without being aware of the fact that they're using this, but they're just using it in a very basic way, right? They know that they can use this to do marshalling and unmarshalling to and from Java objects, and that's pretty much it. And they don't tune anything, they don't tweak anything. And I also see a lot of people making really bad mistakes with this that cost them a lot of performance, for example. So I thought it would be nice to do a little explanation of how does this stuff really work, and how do you really use this effectively, especially when combined with the Spring Boot application. So that's the reason for doing that. So in Spring Boot, the typical use case for something like JSON is when you have a REST API. Right? So you're using Spring MVC or you're using Spring Webflux, and whenever you send a response, you just return some Java object, and it will be turned into a piece of JSON. Or when someone actually sends you some JSON in a post or a put request, that will be unmarshaled onto a Java object. The same can be done with web clients, right? Whenever you're talking to an external service, you need to send some JSON, you need to handle the JSON response. We do this in messaging, whether that's JMS or AMQP or AWS, right? By the way, I want to do a quick shout out, speaking of AWS SQS, to the team that is currently maintaining the Spring Cloud AWS project. This is a community project. It's not run by VMware, but they just released their first major 3.0 release, and they have completely rewritten all of the SQS support in there. And again, part of what is in there is automatic configuration of marshalling to and from JSON. You see it in other places, right? There's storing state, for example. It's writing stuff out to a file or to something like Redis and getting it back in. It's everywhere. And in all of these cases, the reason that you are using JSON for this, or JSON, sorry, is that there is a starter in Spring Boot called Spring Boot Starter JSON, which brings in JSON plus some additional dependencies, which I'll talk about in a moment. And this starter is a transitive dependency of many of the other starters. So if you're including something like Spring Boot Starter Web, which is the typical way that people will consume Spring MVC in their boot applications, this is automatically what you end up with, and then Spring Boot auto configuration configures all of this for you. So as I mentioned, with all of these use cases, the typical use case is marshalling. And I wanted to make sure, just for people who are relatively new to the topic, or that are not native speakers, that we do understand what marshalling actually is. If you look up marshalling in Google, you find images like this. You find a guy just bringing in a plane. And actually, if you look really closely in that little image, you can see he's using Dutch bats, really, because these are like the nice orange things that you have that we have over here. But this is not the marshalling that we're talking about. Marshalling basically means taking a Java object and turning that into some other representation to send over the wire or to a file, in this case JSON. So it's serialization. In the context of this talk, marshalling and serialization are the same thing. Unmarshalling then means taking the JSON and turning that into something that we can process in Java code. Right? It's deserialization. Again, the same things. And typically we do this to custom Java types, right? Java beans or records or something like that. But I'll show you in this in some demos that there are some really nice alternatives available to doing just that as well. So the first thing I want to do is I quickly want to show you what do you get out of the box if you're using something like Spring MVC with Jackson. So for that, I have a very simple application here. What we see here is an account type, and the account type has some fields. There's an ID, a first name, a last name, and an address. And then we have getters for the creation date and for the ID, and we have getters and setters for everything else. Just, that's it. And then we have a web controller. This is a REST controller, as you can see, and it has 3 methods. We can find all of the accounts that we have. We can find a single account, or we can create an account and remember that. Now, I don't actually have a database, so we just store this in a local set, as you can see here for demo purposes. That's absolutely fine. And that's it. So with that, I'm going to start the application, and then I'm going to make some calls to show you what the effect will be. So to do that, I actually have a file, which is this thing. It's a democalls.http file. This is something that IntelliJ supports. Right, so from a file that is called .http, you can simply model a bunch of HTTP requests that you make. It also supports variables, and it supports handling responses. It's really nice. If you haven't looked at this, make sure to check it out. So what I can do now is first get a list of all of the known accounts. Obviously, I don't have any accounts yet, so you can see I'm getting an empty list here. So now we can create an account. So here, actually, I want to create an account for Sergey. So I'm going to do a post here. Just send the first name, last name. I've not included an address in this case. That worked because I'm getting back a 204. And now, if I'm retrieving all accounts again, which I will do here, latency is a bit bigger, then what you'll see is that indeed I now have an ID. I have the first name, last name. The address is there, but it's null. And also the creation date, which happened to be a local date time, is rendered in a nicely formatted ISO standard. So that's some stuff that happens here. Now, going back to that HTTP file, there are a couple of other things I want to show you. So right here, I have another post to create an account for myself. And I work for a company called Trifork. So I have included that company field. But company is not actually a property of the account in Java. So it doesn't map onto anything. But what we'll see is if we're sending this, the call actually succeeds. It's this one, it gets a 204. And now if we again retrieve all of the accounts, we'll see that my account has also been created. But it simply ignored the whole company field that I've sent. So that's one thing that we see there. Also, the address is again included as a null field, right? This is something that when you're designing public REST APIs, you may not necessarily want this, right? It makes a lot of sense in a lot of use cases, I think, to say if something isn't there, if it's null, I should not just not include it in the JSON. The way that Spring Boot works is what we can do is we can go to the application properties here, and we can start to configure some stuff for Jackson right in there. So in this case, for example, you can see that we have a default property inclusion. And what I can do is I can set that to only include fields that are not null. I should be able to restart now. I have the DevTools on my class path, so just building the application should suffice for restarting. I'm going to recreate the first account, find all accounts again. And this time what we see is that we're only getting the fields that actually have a value but there's nothing else there. Now, we typically take this stuff for granted, right? This is what happens when you're using Spring Boot. We don't have to do anything special. What I'm going to show you now is what Boot actually does for us. So in here, I have a configuration class. And it's currently empty. There's nothing in there. But what I'll be doing is I'm going to create my own object mapper bean. So I'm going to say I want to have a bean. It's going to be of type object mapper. There we go. And for that, I'm simply going to return a new object mapper, as is with all of the defaults that we get from the JSON library. Now, by doing this, I'm basically bypassing Spring Boot's auto configuration. I'm saying, no, I'm going to do this myself. You don't have to do anything for me. And what I want to show you now is what happens when we restart the application and try some of this stuff out again. So while that's restarting, let's say we're going to first create an account again that has no unknown fields or whatever. So that was the plain account. There we go. We see that this still works. We're getting back at 204. But now we're going to find the accounts again. We're going to see what happens. And I'm actually getting an error here. It says type definition error. Not sure what that means. So we can actually look at the output of the Spring Boot application here. We see a big fat stack trace. And what it's saying is that, hey, you're using a Java 8 date time type, local date. It's not actually supported out of the box. If you want support for this, you have to register. That's actually later in the message. You have to register some module, whatever that means. So for now, I'll just fix this by saying, let's go into the account. And instead of making this a local date, let's just make this a Java util date, because that support is actually built in. Right? So we're going to do this. We're going to say, OK, do a new date to get the current date. And that's the type that we'll be returning from there. Like that. Rebuild. Try again. So going back here, we're going to create the account again. There we go. I wasn't restarted yet. There we go. Does it work now? Yes. We're going to find all accounts again. And this time it works, but notice that the creation date is just the milliseconds epoch Unix timestamp, right? It's not a nicely formatted thing. Also, in this case, obviously, or maybe not as obviously, so that's why I'm actually showing this, we're still seeing the null account again. Even though in Spring Boot configuration, I said I don't want to see nulls, but I'm bypassing all of that, so obviously that no longer works. What I want to show you is that in my main application here, I actually have a command line runner that prints out the object mapper modules that have been configured on the object mapper bean that I'm using. And it also prints out a configuration property on what to do with unknown properties. And if I go into my, my output here, looking at where the application started up, above this little report, then what we'll see is that if I create my own object mapper here, I don't get any mapper modules registered. There's nothing there. So that's why I don't have support for the Java 8 date time stuff. Also, fail on unknown properties by default is set to true. So that means, which I actually haven't demoed yet, but let me do that, is if I'm trying to create my account again with the company field in here, it will fail. I will get an error saying there's a JSON parse error, unrecognized field company. Right? So by default, JSON does not ignore unknown fields. If we go back into the configuration here, and we remove this object mapper bean again because we realized it's probably a mistake to define it like this ourselves, and we're going to rebuild, everything will start working again, as I demoed already. But what's important to see is that when this application now restarts, I'm going to get that output again that I just showed you, but this time I will see some other output. I have to scroll all the way down. There we go. So what we see now is that there is a list of mapper modules where I have a JDK8 module, I have a datetime JSR310 module, I have a parameter names module. I'm going to explain what that is in a moment. And then there's also some modules that Boot actually defines itself. And next to that, we can see that fail on unknown properties is set to false instead of true as we had before. I'm done actually with showing the date stuff, so I'm quickly going to just completely remove this, and then we'll move on with the presentation. So going back there, what we've seen is that there is a couple of ways that we can use to configure JSON. JSON itself has a bunch of features. This is not just a single thing. You can have serialization features, you can have deserialization features, you can have features on the mapper, and there are some other things, but basically they're all configuration things that you can do. And then there's modules, as we just saw. These are like add-ons or plugins that can also contribute configuration to JSON. And in your code, you can also use annotations, which I haven't shown you yet, to tweak the actual serialization and deserialization of your Java types. And configuring features and modules is something that Boot can help you out with, right? I showed you already that we have the application properties where we can set a bunch of configuration features. Boot also registers modules for you automatically. When it comes to annotations, you do that yourself. So speaking of those modules, actually, it used to be the case, I think, in older versions of Spring Boot, that Spring Boot was also responsible for registering something like the datetime support module. But nowadays, JSON can actually do this itself because it has a service loader mechanism. So it finds these modules on the class path, it will automatically register them, but you have to enable the service loader mechanism. And actually, Boot does that for you. But as we saw in my demo, if I just create my own object mapper, that doesn't happen by default. Also, what we saw is that Boot specifically adds some additional modules as well. Boot also disables the default feature where dates and also duration are actually rendered as numbers, which are Unix timestamps. So we get a nicely formatted date, which is typically what you want, especially in REST APIs. Unknown properties, right? Things in the JSON, fields in the JSON that are not, cannot be mapped onto a Java type will simply be ignored by default in Spring Boot. And we can tune all of this stuff if we want to. A little word about the unknown properties ignored. This is something that I think is a good default, but it will certainly not fit all of your use cases. So you do have to consider this. Maybe some of you are actually familiar with the Zalando REST API principles. Zalando is a company that has published the way that they design and implement REST APIs with a whole bunch of design principles and a whole bunch of rules. And what they actually say is, yeah, for incoming requests, we do not actually want to ignore unknown fields. Because what it means is a tester, for example, could make a mistake and maybe they make a typo in a field. And if then the REST API just ignores that completely, you might get behavior that is actually hard to explain, way harder than when you get an error that says, hey, I have no idea what you're actually trying to tell me because I don't know the field that's being sent. On the other hand, it may be very tricky to do this when you also want to be both backwards and forwards compatible with certain clients, for example. Right? If I deploy something and then I discover, oh, I actually need to temporarily do a rollback and clients are already sending me new fields, it might actually be really beneficial if I can just ignore that. I'm doing that in my own project. I'm actually building a set of APIs, and I think this is a nice default for my use case. But do consider this. So when it comes to configuring this stuff the right way, rather than just defining my own object mapper bean and breaking everything, as I just showed you, there's a couple of options that you have. So first of all, something that we can do is we can configure stuff here in the application properties. We already did that for the default property inclusion, but there are a lot of other things that you can configure here. So you can see already with the code assist that IntelliJ provides here, I can configure things on the mapper. I can configure things specifically for serialization, deserialization. There's a lot of stuff for which I don't have to write any custom code. I can just configure it here. If I do that, then obviously the object mapper that Spring creates for me will use those settings. But it turns out that actually every object mapper that you create in your application through a builder that Spring Boot provides will follow these defaults. So this is good for configuring things that should hold for basically everything, or at least by default, for all object mappers in your application. Let's say that you want to do something that's not possible just through some simple properties. What we can do then is we can go into this configuration here, and we can say we're going to create a bean again, but it's not going to be a full object mapper. It's going to be an object mapper builder customizer, right? Quite a mouthful, but what this thing will do is actually quite straightforward. It's going to return a customizer, which is a functional interface that takes a JSON builder, and then we can configure that builder here. Right, so let me show you the interface. This thing provides us with a JSON2 object mapper builder. So this is a boot class to help you to configure a builder that you can use to create custom object mappers. It's also used to create the default object mapper in boot. And here, through that builder, there's a bunch of stuff that we can do. Use cases for this are, for example, to register custom serializers or deserializers. Maybe you have a custom way that certain types should be handled, and you cannot really just use a simple annotation. You have to write some code for that. This is where you could register that, and that will automatically apply to everything. I'm not going to actually show you a bunch of stuff. I'll show you an example on the slides of something that came out of my own project for this. So this is one thing, but again, this customizer will be applied to all of the object mappers that you use to build Spring Boot. That's not always, again, what you want, right? It might make a lot of sense to say, well, I have some use cases for which I don't want to use the default object mapper with all of its configuration. I want to have a custom one that's configured in a different way. Maybe it should handle enumerations differently, for example, or maybe it should have a different default for case sensitivity, something like that. So if my controller here, for example, would depend on an object mapper, like this, then what I could do is I could create a constructor and say that thing is not actually going to be injected with an object mapper. It's going to be injected with an object mapper builder. Right? So what I can do then is in my code, I can say take the builder, and then on that builder, again, I can configure a bunch of stuff. Formatting defaults, maybe I want to have pretty printing of all of the JSON that I have for this particular object mapper. So I can configure things like also fail on unknown properties, right? Which is the setting that I just configured earlier in my application properties. So maybe for this thing I want it to hold true. And then eventually we just call build and we have our object mapper. So this is the way that you are supposed to be using this stuff in Spring Boot, typically. Because you don't want to just forego all of the nice stuff that you get from Spring Boot's auto configuration. And this is actually the way that this will work. So that is two options, right? I've shown you configuration properties. I've shown you how to do stuff in code. Finally, you can use annotations as well. So if I go into my account, for example, let me first get rid of this thing again. Just undo what I did here. If we go into the account, right now, when this thing is marshaled and unmarshaled, it just uses JSON names that are exactly the same as my Java names, right? Maybe for this particular account, I don't want that. Maybe I want something like snake casing to be applied, for example. So what we can do then is we can say, okay, we want to have different JSON naming here. And this JSON naming, as you can see here, or it's a little small, but actually it takes a property naming strategy. Now for these, JSON actually has various built-in strategies, so we can do a property naming strategies. Let's see, property strategies, as it's called, there we go. And from here, we can choose something like snake casing, for example, or kebab casing, or something that is not the default. So in this case, I want a snake case strategy, set it to class, restart my application again. And now what we'll see is that just for the account, but not for the address, for example, this thing will now marshal using all lower cases with underscores, because that's what snake casing is. So let me show you that. If I go back into my .http file, I can create an account again. So let's do Sergey again. Now notice I haven't updated this thing yet, right? So my JSON here actually still uses default Java casing. So if I send this, I'm not going to get back an error. I will get back a 204. But what happens now is when I say find all accounts over here, I'm going to find an account that only has an ID. And this may surprise you, but this is exactly what we would expect, because we have set the default in boot to ignore unknown fields. And I'm sending two fields that do not actually map because of the snake casing. So it just ignores the first name and last name in this case. So what we should do, obviously, is we should change this to use actual snake casing. So we're going to do this. And now if I send this to override the account, and I find all accounts again, this time we will, oh, actually, I have seen this before. Sometimes the dev tools seem to hold on to some old compiled class. So let me quickly restart to show you that it does actually work and that I'm not just bullshitting you. So we're going to create an account again. Over here. We're going to find all accounts. Over here. And now you see that we indeed have the ID, the first name and the last name, but now in snake casing, right? So these are some options that you have for doing configuration at various levels within your application. Let me get rid of this one again. Let me also undo this, and then again, go back to here. So what I have here is a real example from one of my production applications on how you can use something like a customizer. So what you see here is that we register a serializer by type. So we say whenever we have an offset date time, we don't like the default way that these things are being serialized, so we actually want to truncate the value to seconds first before we marshal it out, because we don't care about milliseconds in the representation, right? This is one example where you can just register this customizer and it will automatically be applied to the object mapper that boot creates, as well as every other object mapper that you create via one of those builders. Now, what JSON does when you do marshalling is it maps fields. So it's good to know what we actually mean when we're talking about a field. And the default in JSON is to use property-based access, so getters and setters. If we look at our account, what I showed you is that for the ID, there was only a getter, there was no setter. That does not mean that it becomes something like a read-only property. If you don't have a setter, but you do have a getter, JSON will just use reflection to immediately populate your field when it needs to do unmarshalling from JSON onto the Java object. That's important to realize. It's not the other way around. If you only have a setter, but you don't have a getter, you do actually get a write-only property for unmarshalling only. You can actually tell JSON to just use direct field access everywhere. Globally, I think that's a really bad idea to do that. But sometimes it makes sense on individual types. So you can use an annotation to do that as well. Also, there is support for unmarshalling by, instead of having a default constructor and then property setters, to use a constructor. That means that there is also some support for records. But I do need to warn you, records are very well supported for marshalling, for serializing, but there are some cases for unmarshalling where they don't work. I was preparing this presentation, and last week, JSON 2.15 came out. And one of the improvements that they made in 2.15 is that there is better support actually in there for records. This morning when I woke up, I saw that Spring Boot, not only Spring Boot 2.3 came out, they are 3.0, sorry, but they also released some minor version updates for Boot 2.7, for example. But even that one that came out today is still using JSON 2.14 something, .3, I think. So be aware of the fact that for most of you, even when you're using Spring Boot 2.7 or 3.0, you will still be using JSON in an older version than what's available now. So you may want to update this, and I'm going to show you this in the next demo. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the account here. Let's make that a bit bigger so you can actually see what I'm doing. And then I'm going to create a constructor, just an all-R constructor, like that. And this is now the only constructor, so actually JSON will know that this is the thing it's supposed to be calling. But if there is any ambiguity, what you can do is you can annotate this with @JSON_creator. This goes on a constructor. It can also go on a static factory method, for example, but I'm using it here. And if you look at the Java doc for this stuff, I'm not expecting you to read this, but it actually says something like, oh yeah, for every argument here, we should actually annotate it with another annotation called JSON property. And we need to provide the name of the property. So we need to do this, and we need to do it for the ID, and we need to do it for the first name, and we need to do it for the last name, and we need to do it for the address. And then I did copy-paste, so now I need to remember, oh yeah, I should not forget to actually update the copy-pasted fields. Of course, I'm making an error here as well, and now I need to do this, and then finally we have this, and this will work. This is tedious. Right? And I had a project where actually we had like hundreds of little classes representing all sorts of REST APIs where we had this add.json property in there. I thought there must be a better way of doing it. And it turns out there is. And this is what the parameter names module does for you. So we saw in the beginning that one of the modules that Spring Boot automatically registers for you is called the parameter names module. What it allows you to do is just say, I don't want to have all of that JSON property stuff in here, so I can just get rid of it again. I just want to have this. Let's see if this actually works. So what we're going to do is, let's put in a breakpoint, and let's see it in the debugger, right? Just so you really see that this is the constructor that's being called. So we're going to restart the app. In this case, let's go back here, and let's create a full account with an address. I have some calls for that as well. So actually, I have my own account here with my office address. This is not my home address. You won't be able to dox me. So let's see. We get into the constructor. You can see all of the fields have been populated, right? There's the ID, first name, last name, and the address has been populated as well, so that's nice. We can create another one. I also can create an address for Josh Long. He actually lives somewhere in production that happens to be in the cloud, so I can do a post for that. Again, we can see everything coming in. Right, so this works. When I was preparing the demo, actually, what I was expecting to happen here was that it would fail. But it didn't. The reason that I was expecting this to fail originally is that to make this stuff work with the parameters module, it's really important that you pass a -parameters flag to the Java compiler when you compile your code. Otherwise, it doesn't store the names of those arguments in the bytecode, and this doesn't work because JSON doesn't know what argument maps to what field. Turns out that if you look in IntelliJ here, and go to the settings, Java C, then actually this stuff is there. So I have here my demo, and you can see that -parameters is actually included by default. So I was wondering, why is that? Is that just IntelliJ doing that? It turns out that when you're using Maven, you don't have to do anything to make this work. Because when we look at our Maven POM, this thing is using Spring Boot 3.06, right? I haven't updated to 3.07 yet because it just came out this morning, and I'm doing a demo. But if we look at the parent there, we can see that this thing has a Maven compiler plugin configuration that sets the parameters to true. Actually, just to make sure that you can really read this, right? There we go. So that thing is included by default when you have the Spring Boot parent POM and you're using Maven. If you're using Gradle, this is not necessarily true. So you need to probably configure this yourself. So I can actually show you how we do that in my own project here. What we have here is a setting where we say, oh yeah, for the compiled Java task, just add the -parameters to the compiler argument. But without this, this stuff actually breaks. So that's important to keep in mind. Let me quickly check, because I have so many demos, it's easy to forget something. If I have everything there that I wanted to show you. This is there, this is there. Yes, one more thing, and then we'll go back to the slides. So with all of this together, you can see that actually it can be sort of tricky to know if everything works as you expect, and therefore it becomes important to write tests. Now, one thing that not everyone may be familiar with, and that I quickly wanted to show here, is that Spring Boot has so-called slice testing support, specifically for working with JSON. So what I have here is I have a little class. I can uncomment this now, and I can remove this. What you see here is that I have a class annotated with @JSONTest. So this is a Spring Boot testing annotation. And what it does is it says I'm going to give you an application context that doesn't have all of the default Spring Boot stuff. It only has the stuff that you need for doing a test. And then it automatically makes something available called a JSON tester. This is an abstraction, so it doesn't only work with JSON, or actually this one does, obviously, because it's called JSON tester. But as you can see here, it actually extends an abstract JSON Marshall tester, and that one is generic. What I can do with this is I can write a test. So here, for example, I can say I have this Java account object. I'm going to marshal it. I'm going to write it out to JSON. But then it gives me a custom type called JSON content. And what's really nice about this one is it integrates with assert for J. So assert for J is an assertion library. So what I can do now is I can say assert that the content that I've created when marshalling out, when writing out my account, is actually equal to the following JSON. And in this case, the JSON is just an inlined multi-line string. But what you can see here is that there are a lot of options as well to compare to stuff from a file, from an input stream. I can also make sure that it's not equal to something. I can apply some other things. There's tons of options there. So that's actually quite nice. Yeah, let's leave it at that for now, because otherwise I'll run out of time. So what we saw, just a recap, with the parameter names module, it prevents you to have to use that JSON property everywhere. You get it by default when you're using Spring Boot, because it registers it for you. It does require the des parameters javac argument, but you get that for free if you're using Maven with Gradle. Probably have to add it yourself. There is another comment here, but I'm going to skip it because I don't have time. So far, we've been looking at marshalling, unmarshalling to custom Java types, right? We wrote an account class, and we used that. That's actually very common, and that's the use case for most people. But there are some alternative options that I wanted to show you. For example, with JSON, you can also just use a map. And you can say, I have a map. The strings are keys. The keys are strings. And that's just the field name. And the value can be whatever value you have in JSON. It could be a simple, plain scalar value. It could be another object. It could be a list, basically. And this works for both marshalling and unmarshalling. There are some nice use cases for this. I use this a lot when I need to make a request with a REST template, for example, and don't really want to model the whole thing using some custom type, or for wrapping some stuff. And I actually have a demo where I can show you that. This requires internet, by the way, so we'll see if this works. Otherwise, I'll just explain what I'm doing. In this other project, I have some tests. I'm going to move to the first one. What you see here is that I'm creating a map. Right? So I'm using a map.off here to say I have a key that maps to a string value, and I have another key that maps to another map, which has a nested field with a list. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this object, this map, to tell the REST template here, just send this over to HTTP bin. And this is a service that will just echo back to me what I sent to that service. And I'm going to print out the result. So let's see if this actually works. And otherwise, you'll just have to trust me. There we go. So application has started up. We're making the request. And if HTTP bin.org feels up to it, we will get a response that says, oh yeah, you've just sent me a piece of JSON that has two fields. It has a key and it has something else. I'm getting a 504. This is actually HTTP bin. This is not the Wi-Fi here. This is HTTP bin, but I think I might have woken it up. Let's give it one more go. But this is a really nice way of saying, oh yeah, I need to make some ad hoc custom request. I don't really feel like modeling this thing. Now it works. So what we see is that we get a response, and in the response it says, this is the JSON object that you just send to HTTP bin, right? And it looks exactly as what we would have expected. A more typical use case maybe for this is to say, well, you know, I already have a custom type. So here, let me make this a bit bigger. Here I have a type called conference. The conference has a name, and I need to send it to some external service, but it doesn't expect just a name. No, it actually expects a field called conference, and that one has an object with a name. That's really common, and I don't really feel like creating something like a conference request, which is really just a wrapper object around conference, just to make this thing. So what we can do here is we can also say we want to have a map where the key is conference, but the value is this custom Java object. So what happens now is everything will still get marshaled out, as you would expect, but we can very easily create this inline wrapper, basically, for the conference object. Again, because of the time, I'm going to not demo this. I'm just going to move on. For handling responses, we can do the same thing. So here, we're getting back a response from HTTP bin. We can actually see that because I still have it here. And in this response, we also have headers. And one of the headers is the user agent here, which is Java 17 for me. Let's say we want to extract that. What we could do is we're going to say, well, we're going to make a request, and then the response is going to be marshaled into a map. So we can print out the whole thing then. What we can also do is say, from that map, get the headers. The headers here are again a Java object, which is a map. So we can cast it to map from string to object, and then from there get the user agent. Now again, this works, but if you look at this, this is tedious, right? Java is not really intended for this stuff. If you're using something like Groovy with a JSON slurper and JPath, if you know what that is, that's perfect for this sort of thing. But Java doesn't really work nicely with this. So, turns out, there are other options as well. What you can also do is you can use JSON to say I want to unmarshal to a JSON node. And a JSON node is really just like a tree structure. You can use that as is, but that's not the typical way to do it. You can actually consume it through two APIs. There is a JSON Pointer API and there is a JSONPath one. So going back here, let me quickly show you that. What I have here is I have a JSON Pointer type. This is included in JSON itself. And JSON Pointer is a really simple spec that allows you to point to an individual node in a JSON document. So this thing is thread safe. So in a normal application, you would make this like a static field. And I can say I want to have from the headers the user agent. And then when we have this JSON node here as a type, we can simply say from that node, give me the value at that particular point as text. And there's other methods here as well. So I can say I want to have it as a Boolean or as an int or a long, depending, of course, on what the type of that field is. So that's nice. But this is only for simple stuff where you can just point to a single thing. If you want to do something more complex, what you can do is you can use JSONPath. JSONPath is a separate library, and you may be familiar with it because it's included in the Spring Boot testing support. But you can also use this in production code. So here I can write an expression like this that says, just give me every user agent field that you can find somewhere in the document and extract that. That's going to be a list, and then from there we can actually get that. If you want to use this, be aware of the fact that you will need some configuration because JSONPath by default does not use JSON. So I can show you that configuration quickly here. So what we see here is that we're going to have some configuration for JSONPath where we say we want to have a JSON provider, we want to have a JSON mapping provider, and then we create this defaults interface by implementing it to return these things. And we then configure that object as a configuration. Right? This is just something that you need to have one time, and then this stuff simply works. And you can do some really nice things with there. If you have like a really complex setup and you need to extract some field where the sibling field actually has a certain value and it should be located under something that has something else, right? These sort of things become very tedious to program, whereas having a query language like JSONPath actually make this very straightforward. Now, final thing I want to just mention here is views. So by default, when you marshal something with JSON, it just marshals out all of the fields. You can annotate a field to say ignore it, so it's never there. But sometimes it makes sense to say only in certain scenarios do I want to include a field. And for that, you can use something which is called views. And the nice thing is, these things are supported in Spring Web, so in Spring MVC or in Spring Web Flux. Yeah, I'm just going to use all of my time, so let's do a very quick demo for that. What I can do here is I'm going to create a new class. I'm going to call it views. And within the views, I'm going to create a static, let's go public static class. And I'll call it summary, like this. What I can do now is if I have this, I can go into my account and say, oh yeah, the ID field that I have here, this one should be included whenever I have a JSON view, which will be this views.summary. And I probably want the same thing for just the last name. Right? Now what I can do is I can go into my controller, and I can say when I do a find all, which we have over here, I actually want it to use that particular JSON view. So if we now restart the application here, what will happen is that I can create fully populated objects. So that's the first thing I'm going to do. Let's see if I still have one available here. Yes. So we're going to create myself. We're going to create Josh. It's not there yet. There we go. And this one. And now, if we find all accounts again, what we see is I'm just going to get the ID and the last name included, right? And nothing else. You may be wondering, why do I create a class for all of this, right? Why isn't it just a string? The reason is that what I can do is something like this, where I say I'm going to have an extended summary. And the extended summary literally extends the summary view. And now I can go back into my account object and say the first name, for example, should be included when I do an extended view. So it's going to be an extended summary. And now if I go into my controller, I can say I want to have the extended summary. And the effect will be that now I'm going to see all fields including the ones that simply said summary, because the extended summary literally extends the other view. Right? So that's a nice feature to have. So to round off, I want to close off with some best practices. As I've shown you, whenever you want to create your own object mapper, use boot. Also, just don't create new object mappers all the time. I see people doing that. It's extremely inefficient. You should always reuse them. And this also goes for testing. It makes sense to have something like a static field defined in some test class to say, this is my object mapper I want to use whenever I need one. Because otherwise, it's going to have to use reflection whenever it needs to find out how to unmarshal to something over and over and over again. It can be really inefficient, so don't do that. Be careful when you're using records. I didn't really have time to demo stuff that breaks with records, but unmarshaling to records is limited in its support, especially before JSON 2.15, but even with 2.15 there are some things that don't work. Make sure to write tests when you rely on things that you need to configure. We've seen that there is dedicated testing support, so you can actually do that. Stay away from extract types, right? If you want to marshal out something and your field is not a concrete type, but it's just an interface or something, there is no way to unmarshal back to that without additional type information. It's just not a really good fit to use something like abstract types if you want to use JSON to go both ways. So probably don't want to do that. And finally, my final advice, stop using regex to parse JSON. Right? We have excellent tooling available in the Java ecosystem. Spring Boot does a great job of configuring all of it for you, so please use that when you can. My name is Joris Kuipers. Thank you for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.